that actually affects not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but it also affects American technology companies and, by extension, American citizens. So, that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch. Thank you. 3 minutes ago, the world watched as Donald Trump unleashed a furious tirade against Keir Starmer live on television, and Britain is reeling. It wasn't a passing remark. It wasn't a joke. It was a full-scale assault that cut through the air like a lightning strike, leaving millions stunned, gasping, and scrambling to understand what they had just witnessed. Within seconds, social media erupted. Headlines screamed across the globe, and Starmer's political future was thrown into chaos. What unfolded in that moment wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a showdown so explosive, so brutal, that it may have changed the course of Britain's politics forever. Section 1. It began innocently enough during what seemed like a routine press conference in Florida. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled, and Donald Trump appeared ready to deliver his usual hard-hitting takes on the state of America, the upcoming election, and the shifting balance of power across the world. But then one journalist asked about Labour's leader Keir Starmer and his recent pledge to reset relations with Washington if his party came to power. The question seemed casual, the kind of soft inquiry that politicians often brush off with a bland response. But Trump's expression changed instantly. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and the energy in the room shifted. Everyone sensed it. Something was about to explode. And then it happened. Trump leaned toward the microphone, locked his gaze on the cameras, and with a mocking pause uttered Starmer's name. The next words were not just criticism. They were a hammer blow. Never seen a weaker leader in my life. The sentence hit like a thunderclap, reverberating across the press room, leaving journalists wide-eyed and scrambling to capture every word. Trump's tone wasn't restrained or diplomatic. It was raw, personal, and dripping with disdain. He wasn't offering policy critique. He was dismantling a man's image in real time, live before millions. The attack didn't stop there. With the fire building in his voice, Trump launched into a blistering tirade against Starmer's record. He slammed him on Brexit, accusing him of trying to undo the will of the British people. He branded him soft on crime, weak on borders, incapable of defending Britain's future. Each line was sharper, more brutal, more unforgiving than the last. And then came the phrase that detonated like dynamite: Starmer is nothing more than a puppet for Brussels. In that single moment, Trump didn't just insult a political opponent. He rewrote the conversation in Britain. The room itself seemed to buckle under the weight of his words. Reporters gasped, cameras flashed, keyboards clattered in a frenzy as journalists realized they were witnessing history unfold. And across the Atlantic, millions of Britons watching live television were left speechless. Social media lit up instantly, hashtags exploding into global trends. Memes, outrage, and cheers flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook within seconds. Supporters of Brexit hailed Trump as the truth-teller Britain needed, while Labour loyalists scrambled to defend their leader, some accusing Trump of foreign interference, others begging Starmer's team to fight back. But Starmer's camp stayed silent. No immediate response, no fiery rebuttal, just silence. And that silence was louder than any words. It told a story of hesitation, of panic, of a leadership team blindsided by the force of Trump's assault. Across Britain, commentators were already predicting the fallout. This wasn't just an insult, it was humiliation on the world stage, a moment that voters would not forget, no matter how much Labour tried to spin it. Within minutes, British tabloids plastered their front pages with headlines: Trump destroys Starmer, weakest leader I've ever seen, puppet for Brussels. Television panels rushed to dissect the chaos. Radio phones lit up with furious callers. The aftermath of Trump's tirade was immediate, violent, and unstoppable. In the age of viral politics, where one phrase can define a leader, Trump's words spread like wildfire. Clips of the press conference were chopped into short videos and blasted across TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The moment he said "weakest leader" and "puppet for Brussels" was replayed endlessly, turning into memes, sound bites, and headlines that refused to fade. Within an hour, hashtags like Trump vs. Starmer, "puppet for Brussels," and "weakest leader" trended worldwide, dominating timelines from London to New York. For millions of people who hadn't even watched the live broadcast, the story reached them anyway, hitting their phones, their televisions, and their conversations. It was inescapable. Inside Labour headquarters, the silence grew heavy. Advisors were caught in a storm of indecision. Should they hit back hard, risking a transatlantic feud that would dominate the news cycle even longer? Or should they downplay the remarks, dismissing them as the rantings of an American ex-president? Neither option looked safe. To fight back risked giving Trump even more oxygen, but to stay quiet risked letting the perception of weakness settle like concrete. Every second that passed without a response hardened the narrative. Britain was watching, waiting, and wondering why their would-be Prime Minister wasn't defending himself. Meanwhile, the British media seized the moment with ruthless energy. Tabloids already skeptical of Labour plastered front pages with Trump's most cutting lines, treating them like undeniable truths. Starmer humiliated on world stage, screamed one. Trump exposes Britain's weakest leader, shouted another. Even broadsheets that leaned more neutral couldn't ignore the drama. Their coverage might have been measured, but the headlines still hammered the same message. Trump's words had landed, and Starmer looked shaken. Television studios turned into battle arenas. Political commentators, journalists, and party insiders filled panel discussions, each trying to spin the event. Some claimed Trump had overstepped, interfering in British politics. Others argued he had simply voiced what many Britons already believed. But beneath all the noise, one point was clear. Starmer had taken a hit, and it was one of the hardest of his career. On Britain's streets, the reaction was raw and emotional. In working-class towns, especially those that had voted for Brexit, Trump's phrase "puppet for Brussels" rang like a bell. For years, suspicion had lingered over Labour's true stance on Brexit. Many voters distrusted Starmer, remembering his shifting positions during the referendum fallout. Trump's blunt attack crystallized those suspicions into something more powerful. Callers on radio shows raged that Starmer couldn't be trusted. Local Facebook groups filled with furious debates, some saying Trump had only confirmed what they already knew, that Starmer was soft, untrustworthy, and too close to Europe. Conservatives wasted no time exploiting the moment. Though senior Tories avoided directly echoing Trump's most incendiary language, they subtly fed the narrative. Ministers reminded the press that Britain needed strong leadership on the world stage, not someone who flinched under foreign pressure. Anonymous briefings to journalists described Trump's remarks as brutal but not surprising. Strategists privately admitted they couldn't have scripted it better themselves. An attack they had struggled to make stick had now been delivered for them in front of millions by one of the most famous political figures on earth. All they had to do was sit back and let the storm rage. And then came Nigel Farage. The Reform UK leader, never one to miss an opening, jumped into the spotlight with his trademark grin. He praised Trump for saying out loud what millions of Britons think. Farage declared that Starmer had been exposed before the world as weak and unreliable. His framing was simple and devastating. Trump had spoken the truth, and Labour's leader had been unmasked. For Farage's supporters, this was confirmation. For undecided voters, it was fuel for doubt. By aligning himself with Trump's outburst, Farage positioned himself once again as the voice of ordinary people, the man unafraid to confront the establishment. Labour's eventual response came hours later, but by then it was too late. The statement was cautious, restrained, almost timid. It spoke of Starmer's commitment to a strong partnership with the United States and brushed aside Trump's words as irrelevant. But the damage had already been done. By the time Labour spoke, Trump's clip had been watched millions of times, dissected on news shows, embedded in articles, and replayed in memes across the internet. The silence that followed the attack had left an image burned into the public mind. Starmer, hesitant, uncertain, diminished. As dawn broke the following day, the storm had not faded. It had only grown stronger, louder, and more dangerous for Starmer. News outlets across Britain and beyond opened with the same clip, looping it over and over. Trump narrowing his eyes, leaning forward, and delivering the fatal blow. Never seen a weaker leader in my life. Puppet for Brussels. It didn't matter whether people agreed with Trump or despised him. What mattered was that his words had sunk deep into Britain's political bloodstream. Breakfast shows debated it relentlessly. Headlines screamed from every newsstand, and voters who hadn't cared much about international politics suddenly found themselves asking whether their own leader had just been humiliated before the world. The power of repetition turned Trump's insult into a permanent mark, branding Starmer with weakness, like a scar he could not shake. Inside Labour's headquarters, the mood was frantic. Meetings stretched late into the night and resumed at dawn. Advisors clashed bitterly over strategy. Some urged Starmer to strike back with fire, to deliver a bold speech, calling Trump out and proving he could stand tall under pressure. Others argued that acknowledging Trump directly would only prolong the crisis and trap Labour in a fight it could not win. The indecision itself became a weakness. Each hour of hesitation fed the impression that Labour's leader was paralyzed, unsure of how to defend himself, and too cautious to take control of the moment. Leaks from these tense meetings trickled out to journalists, who gleefully reported on Labour's chaos behind closed doors. The story wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about a party in turmoil, unable to rally behind its leader at the moment he needed it most. Across Britain, the effect on ordinary voters was visceral. In pubs, on buses, in workplaces, people weren't quoting policy points or campaign pledges. They were quoting Trump. The phrases "weakest leader" and "puppet for Brussels" rolled off tongues with ease, repeated in conversations as though they were facts. For voters who had always felt uneasy about Labour's stance on Brexit, Trump's words confirmed their doubts. For those who didn't follow politics closely, the clip was simple, powerful, and easy to understand. And in politics, perception is often stronger than truth. Starmer could have the best policy platform in decades, but if the image of weakness stuck, it would overshadow everything else. The Conservative Party recognized this reality immediately. Though Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and senior ministers kept their language measured in public, they didn't hesitate to exploit the moment. Carefully worded statements emphasized the need for strong leadership in uncertain times. Anonymous sources briefed journalists that Starmer's silence was concerning, and a glimpse of what he would be like on the world stage. Tory strategists behind closed doors could barely contain their satisfaction. They had spent months trying to brand Starmer as indecisive and soft, and now Trump had done their work for them in 3 explosive minutes. But it wasn't just the Conservatives. Nigel Farage sensed blood in the water and pounced with his usual flair. He toured media studios declaring that Trump had exposed Starmer for what he truly was, a leader who couldn't stand up for Britain. Trump only said what millions of ordinary people have been thinking, Farage told one interviewer. His words were already spreading across social media. To his supporters, Farage framed the moment as proof that he, not Starmer, was the real defender of sovereignty. And to many disillusioned voters tired of mainstream parties, that message was intoxicating. For Starmer, every attempt to move the conversation forward collapsed under the weight of the Trump clip. In interviews, he tried to steer focus back to domestic issues, the NHS, housing, the cost of living, but journalists kept dragging him back. Every time he spoke, the first question was always the same. What's your response to Donald Trump? His careful, measured answers sounded cautious, even timid compared to the raw force of Trump's attack. Instead of projecting calm strength, he looked like a man on the defensive, struggling to escape a shadow that grew darker with every passing day. The impact rippled far beyond Britain. International media outlets seized on the drama, framing it as a diplomatic rupture that revealed deep cracks in the so-called special relationship. American commentators marveled at how Trump, even out of office, still held the power to shake another country's political foundations with a single outburst. European outlets went further, suggesting that Britain under Starmer would be too fragile to stand alone in the post-Brexit world. These narratives, whether fair or not, amplified the perception of weakness that Labour so desperately wanted to avoid. By the time the second week of fallout had begun, the Trump-Starmer clash was no longer just a headline. It had become a saga. What should have been a single explosive moment at a press conference had morphed into a relentless cycle of scrutiny, speculation, and humiliation. News anchors still replayed the clip with theatrical precision, slowing down the moment Trump spat the words "weakest leader" and looping the phrase "puppet for Brussels" until it burned itself into the minds of voters. Television producers knew the drama was gold, and they milked it for every ounce of ratings. From early morning shows to late-night panels, the attack was treated not as news that had passed, but as an unfolding story, a crisis still alive, breathing, and spreading. For Starmer, there was no escape. Every time he walked into an interview, the air was thick with the unasked question. Would he finally fight back? Yet each time his responses were the same: calm, careful, cautious. He dismissed Trump as irrelevant, a man without power, a voice from another country. On paper, these strategies sounded reasonable. In reality, it sounded weak. To voters, it didn't look like restraint. It looked like fear. It looked like he was hiding behind politeness while being pummeled in plain view. And in a political world where strength is performance, perception was everything. Inside Labour headquarters, the situation was dire. Advisors were split into warring factions. One group begged Starmer to deliver a forceful rebuttal, to stand at a podium and look into the cameras with the same intensity Trump had used to show Britain he could take a punch and throw one back. Another group insisted that fighting Trump would only pour fuel on the fire, dragging Labour into a transatlantic feud it could never win. The debates turned bitter. Voices were raised behind closed doors, and the leaks poured out into the press. Articles about Labour divided and uncertain began to appear daily, feeding the perception that the party wasn't just under attack, it was collapsing from within. Meanwhile, the Conservatives watched and waited, their silence more damaging than any direct attack. They didn't need to dirty their hands when Trump had already done the work for them. Ministers nodded gravely in interviews, talking about the importance of standing. As the days turned into weeks, the aftermath of Trump's tirade continued to reverberate across the political landscape. Starmer's team scrambled to regain control of the narrative, rolling out carefully curated appearances and interviews, trying to pivot the conversation back to domestic issues. Yet, the shadow of Trump's words loomed large, casting doubt not just on Starmer's leadership, but on Labour's overall electability. Meanwhile, Conservative strategists capitalized on the turmoil with quiet satisfaction. They avoided direct attacks but framed their messaging around stability and strength, painting Starmer's Labour as fractured and weak. The narrative of a party unable to defend itself or its leader gained traction among voters fatigued by political infighting. Nigel Farage, sensing an opportunity to further fragment the opposition, doubled down on his criticisms. With sharp media appearances and viral social media posts, he positioned himself as the unapologetic voice of those disillusioned by the mainstream. His influence swelled among Brexit supporters, many of whom saw Trump's brutal honesty as a refreshing alternative to what they perceived as political spin. Across the Atlantic, Trump appeared to relish the chaos. His advisors hinted at further interventions, suggesting that the former president viewed this as a chance to reassert his influence on the global stage, at least symbolically. American pundits debated the implications, with some warning that Trump's interference risked damaging a special relationship between the US and the UK, while others saw it as a strategic move to destabilize Labour and help conservative allies. Amid the escalating crisis, a question loomed larger than ever. Could Starmer recover from this political blow? Or had Trump's scathing words irreversibly damaged his reputation, consigning Labour to a precarious position ahead of what could be the most consequential election in decades? As polling continued to reflect the fallout, Labour insiders pressed for a decisive plan. A moment where Starmer could demonstrate resilience, assert his vision for Britain's future, and finally silence his critics. But with the opposition circling and the media spotlight unrelenting, that moment seemed increasingly elusive. In the weeks to come, all eyes would remain fixed on the Labour leader. Would he find the strength to fight back? Or would the echoes of Trump's attack continue to shape the story of British politics for the foreseeable future? As the political storm showed no signs of abating, Starmer's leadership faced mounting pressure from within his own party. Senior Labour figures, once cautiously supportive, began voicing frustration in private meetings. Some urged him to adopt a more aggressive stance, arguing that only by confronting Trump's accusations head-on could he begin to rebuild his standing. Others warned that an open confrontation risked escalating tensions and distracting from Labour's policy agenda. Behind closed doors, advisers debated the merits of a high-profile speech, something bold enough to reclaim the narrative and reassure wavering voters. Yet Starmer remained cautious, wary of being pulled into a media spectacle that could further undermine his authority. His silence was strategic, but in the eyes of many, it only reinforced the image of uncertainty and weakness that Trump's words had ignited. The media frenzy showed no signs of cooling. Every minor misstep was seized upon as evidence of Labour's unraveling. Opposition politicians used the controversy as a weapon in their campaigns, contrasting Starmer's perceived hesitancy with their own promises of decisive leadership. The phrase, "puppet for Brussels," became a rallying cry in some conservative circles, weaponized to stoke fears about sovereignty and Britain's post-Brexit future. International observers watched closely, with some analysts suggesting that the incident underscored a broader challenge facing modern politics: the power of viral moments to shape public perception, often overshadowing substantive debate. The Trump-Starmer clash was more than just a personal attack. It was a case study in how political theatre could redefine an election campaign. In response, Labour ramped up